Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries RPG podcast. This is my first episode of 2024 after falling off a bit near the end of last year due to work and other stresses. Now I've decided to try and dedicate an hour of my time each evening to doing RPG or hobby related stuff. I'm not saying I'll manage it each night without fail, but I thought an hour is nice and manageable, and hopefully it'll allow me to get episodes out more regularly, and also mean that I'm not always running behind when it comes to planning out my game sessions, which has been something of a problem for me, particularly towards the end of 2023. All of which is a handy segue to talk about my plans for this year, and to launch into talking about, whilst I'm unofficially referring to this year in my RPG hobbying as the Year of the Hammer. For various reasons which I won't go into detail in this episode, my EZD6 campaign which ran last year has been shelved for the moment, partly due to scheduling stuff and also due to several of the group feeling like the characters had become super powerful and it was quite difficult to provide challenges, for me as a GM, that the party combat monkeys couldn't just one-shot, whilst non-combatants were likely to get one-shotted themselves if they were unlucky enough to be in the wrong place when the bad guy's hammer came down. So of course with this decided, the next question was, well, what are we going to play next? Well, I've really been getting into Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition from Cubicle 7 recently. Specifically, I've purchased all of their books and companion pieces related to the Enemy Within campaign. For those not aware, this campaign was originally published in the 1980s by Games Workshop and then again by Hogshead Publishing in the late 1990s. There have been various alternate books and manners in which they were published over the years. If you want a more comprehensive look at this sort of thing, I would suggest checking out the excellent blog Awesome Lies. There'll be a link in the description of this episode. It's a great resource for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and I've been eagerly devouring the articles and posts on there to prepare myself for running Woofrup. Now, this isn't my first experience with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. I own both a copy of the Hogshead reprint of the first edition, with a smattering of supplements, and a copy of the second edition which was developed by Green Ronin and published in 2004 by Black Industries. I have a fair few of the supplements in hard copy for second edition, and the rest I picked up in PDF as part of a Humble bundle a while back, although I never really got Woofrup second edition to the table, if I'm perfectly honest. So what about my history with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay? Well, like a lot of people, certainly in the UK, and I suspect in the world at large, I got into wargaming when I was in my teens, in particular those created by Games Workshop, with Warhammer Fantasy Battle being one of our favourites. Myself and a group of friends would spend hours at weekends pushing our forces of chaos, dwarves, undead and others around the table, trying to batter the opposing armies into submission, also painting and converting the models as best we could. We even went to a few of the tournaments held at the Games Workshop HQ back in the day, and one thing that became progressively more clear to me with each tournament that we went to was that I was enjoying painting and coming up with a background for my armies far more than I was enjoying the actual wargame itself. Now, I'd heard of role-playing games by this point and had flicked through a few in my friendly local gaming store. I'd even picked up the original Advanced Fighting Fantasy books, which I'm a big fan of, and have been avidly reading them. But I'd not really played an RPG at that point, although I'd played some what I like to refer to as role-play adjacent games, like Hero Quest, which was a collaboration between MB Games and Games Workshop, and a few of the early D&D board games. Whenever I'd broached the subject of trying out an RPG with my friends, the idea had been met with cautious disinterest. It seemed odd at the time to us, the idea of playing a single character and working collaboratively against monsters and NPCs played by the GM, rather than controlling massive armies and trying to thrash each other on the green felt sheets of battle. When I stumbled across a copy of Woofrup First Edition in my local gaming store, it seemed as though the gods of chaos had finally answered my prayers. After all, we were all big fans of the background and various fans of the Warhammer fantasy world. Perhaps here was a game that would allow us to make the leap from mass battles to RPGs. Of course, as with all the best laid plans, it didn't really work out like that, and after a brief campaign involving my younger brother and a couple of friends, one sadly no longer with us, everyone wanted to dive back into the mass battles and war games, seeing the RPG as little more than an interesting diversion. Not me though. As the person who had been GMing the game, after all, as was often the case back in those days, I was the one with the book, so I was the GM. I'd had a glimpse of something that appealed to me far more than the mass ranks of elven and goblin spearmen in Warhammer Fantasy Battle. I didn't jump straight into becoming a forever GM for RPGs, of course. This was in the pre-internet days, and there wasn't exactly a bustling RPG scene in the small town where I live. Or, if there was, I wasn't aware of it. So I spent a long time trying to prop up my flagging interest in war games, since playing them with my friends was still fun and was better than doing nothing. However, it hadn't really compared to the enjoyment I'd gotten from running the Oldenhaler contract, which was a small sample adventure from the back of the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Still, it will be a few years before I properly jumped into RPGs and bid a fond farewell to wargaming. Although, to be honest, even today I've still got a shed load of miniatures languishing on my shelves at home. However, I'd started to hear about this nigh-mythical kind of campaign for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay that had received an awful lot of praise, and it was called The Enemy Within. But I either never saw the books or didn't have the money to buy them at the time. Years later, I would have the opportunity to play through the first part of the campaign when Sean Connors ran it online for a small group, some of which became great friends and I hope to lure into my own future campaign of Wolfrub. I started off playing a gruff dwarven troll slayer because why wouldn't you? Suffice to say, we didn't do great in the first section, and the resulting chaos ritual flooded the town with demons, leading to my character helping the rest of the party escape, then turning and heading back to the town, determined to salve his great disgrace and die a worthy death fighting the chaos spawn that now ran rampant through the city. I played a couple of other characters, but we didn't really get far into the second part of the campaign before the game sadly folded. Still, it's one of the games I remember most fondly and was one of my first experiences of playing online. So if we jump closer to the present, I was vaguely aware that Cubicle 7 had released a 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and were planning to release a series of books that they referred to as a director's cut of The Enemy Within. I didn't really look into it since I hadn't played 1st edition for ages, and I never even got 2nd edition to the table, as I was saying. I knew there'd been a 3rd edition as well, but when I briefly looked into it, it looked quite board gamey with lots of components, and that had put me off. However, I read a few reviews of the 4th edition, and it seemed to have moved the game back to more towards its 1st edition and 2nd edition roots, with most of the reviews being largely positive. Still, I didn't pick up a copy at that point. It was only whilst I was scouring eBay and picking up some books that I'd either owned in the past or had wanted to own, nostalgia is a powerful drug after all, such as an old edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battles, Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader, and the reprints of the 2 Realms of Chaos books, that my thoughts turned once more to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. At this point, I stumbled across a series of videos on a YouTube channel called Zygmunt Thotep, again link in the description down below, where the author of the channel created a character for each edition of Wolfrub and chatted about the differences between the various editions. I very much enjoyed these videos, and they persuaded me to finally pull the trigger and purchase a copy of 4th edition. And having done that, and always having wanted a copy of The Enemy Within, I decided to buy the first book in the series, titled Enemy in Shadows, which was the part of the story I was familiar with, and also I bought the accompanying companion book that gave extra background information and material to expand the game. Straight away I was hooked, since it reminded me of how much I'd enjoyed playing that Dwarven Troll Slayer so many years previously. I mentioned that I was picking them up to a couple of people from the old group who seemed pretty keen to do some Wolfrub again. Better yet, the new version specifically includes ways to adapt the adventures in the campaign to change it up a bit if your group has played through it previously, which I think is a great idea. Of course, as an avid collector of RPG books, I couldn't stop there, and soon I added additional source books of 4th edition to my gaming shelves, although I still had no thoughts at this point of running it beyond maybe some point in the future. So when our EZD6 campaign was shelved, this seemed like a prime opportunity to suggest Wolfrub 4th edition as a potential replacement game, and most people I spoke to seemed to be up for it. I quickly repurposed our previously arranged next session to have a general discussion about the next game and to sound out people's interest in person, including sending an invite to the additional people who had expressed interest in Wolfrub. I'm hoping that, when we've all had a chat about it, my players will be up for giving it a go, and maybe we can look at getting characters created for the game. I'm aware, thanks to the excellent guides and tips from the Awesome Lies blog, that running The Enemy Within is a fairly mammoth undertaking, and it's been a long while since I've run a published campaign that wasn't a sandbox, so it will definitely be a challenge for me as a GM, especially since I'll have to get myself up to speed on the current version of the rules. I've already let my players know that I'll probably need a month or two's prep before we get started, but I'm hopeful we can get a decent campaign out of it, even if we don't end up getting all the way through the whole thing. All of which is my roundabout way of saying that I'm probably going to be talking a fair bit about Wolfrub on the podcast this year, since it's hopefully going to be the game I'm running for my regular group. Although, if I can find time, I may try and crowbar in an additional sort of OSR D&D style game. We'll just have to see. Now, although Wolfrup's very different to D&D, it still scratches that old school itch of mine, and I'm very much looking forward to cracking open the enemy within in a manner akin to revisiting an old friend you've lost touch with for a long while. I hope you find future episodes interesting, and if you've got any suggestions or would like to tell me about your own experiences with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, or any other grim, dark fantasy or old school games, I'd love to hear from you, and there's details in the description on how you can get in touch. So until I see you again, take care, stay safe, and whatever you're playing, have fun.